In the winter of 1931, a woman named Clara Hoffmann fed her family of 5 for 14 weeks without spending a single dollar on food. Not because she was rich, not because she had land. She lived in a rented house on the edge of Wichita, Kansas, with a backyard the size of a living room and a husband who had been out of work since August. The temperature dropped to 6 degrees in January. The nearest grocery store was 3 miles away, and she couldn't afford what was on the shelves anyway. Her children did not go hungry. Not once. When her daughter Helen was interviewed decades later for an oral history project at the University of Kansas, she was asked what she remembered most about that winter. She didn't say hardship. She didn't say fear. She said, "I remember the smell of the kitchen. It always smelled like something was cooking." Clara had built something before the crisis hit that made the crisis almost irrelevant. Not a fortune. Not a stockpile bought with money she didn't have. She had built a food system, a layered, interlocking set of skills and relationships and preserved supplies that operated completely outside the grocery store economy. And by the time the Depression made grocery stores unaffordable for millions of Americans, Clara had already stopped needing them. Here is what should disturb you about that sentence. The average American household today spends between $800 and $1,200 per month on food. Groceries, restaurants, delivery apps, meal kits, coffee runs, vending machines. The USDA tracks this. That number has increased 25% since 2020 alone, and virtually every dollar of it flows through a system that did not exist 100 years ago. A centralized industrial food supply that replaced, almost entirely, the household food production that kept families like Clara's not just alive, but stable, warm, and fed through the worst economic collapse in modern history. The grocery store is so embedded in modern life that most people have never stopped to ask what existed before it. The answer is not nothing. The answer is everything Clara knew. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how she built her system, what it cost her, what it produced, and what the equivalent looks like for a household in 2025. Stay with me, because the skill Clara used in week 11, when the temperature was at its lowest and the pantry looked emptiest, is the one that holds the entire system together. And it is the one nobody teaches anymore. Before we go into how Clara's system worked, I want to give you a number that puts everything in context. In 1930, the average American household produced approximately 30% of its own food. Gardens, chickens, preserved goods, foraged plants, home-baked bread. 30% of what a family ate came from their own labor, not from a store. By 1970, that number had dropped to less than 3%. Today, it is effectively zero for most urban and suburban households. That collapse did not happen because people stopped wanting food security. It happened because an entire industry, seed companies, fertilizer manufacturers, packaged food producers, grocery chains, fast food corporations, spent decades and billions of dollars making home food production feel unnecessary, old-fashioned, and too time-consuming for a modern life. They were selling you convenience. What they were actually selling you was dependency. Clara was not dependent. Here is exactly what she built, and here's what it means for your grocery bill right now. The first layer of Clara's system was the garden. Not a hobby garden. Not a decorative flower bed with a tomato plant in the corner. No. A working food garden designed with the same logic a farmer applies to a field. Maximum caloric output per square foot, planted in succession so something was always producing, maintained with materials that cost nothing because they came from the household itself. Clara's garden covered about 200 square feet, the backyard of a rented house. She grew pole beans because they climb vertically and produce heavily in small spaces. She grew zucchini because a single plant produces more food than most people can eat. She grew tomatoes, sweet peppers, onions, and garlic. She grew a row of kale because it survives frost and keeps producing when everything else has died. And along the fence, she grew climbing cucumber vines that used the fence as a trellis and cost her nothing in materials. The USDA's own research, replicated multiple times since, shows that a well-managed 200-square-foot vegetable garden produces between $800 and $1,200 worth of fresh produce per growing season at current grocery prices. Clara didn't know that number. She just knew that from May through October, her family ate almost entirely from that patch of ground, and what they didn't eat immediately went into the next layer of her system. That layer was preservation. Every week from July through September, Clara preserved what the garden produced in excess of what the family ate fresh. She canned tomatoes in glass jars using a water bath canner she had bought secondhand for 60 cents. She pickled cucumbers in salt brine. No special equipment, no vinegar she had to buy. Just salt, water, and a ceramic crock that had belonged to her mother. She dried beans on screens made from old window mesh stretched over wooden frames her husband built from scrap lumber. She made apple butter from the fruit of a neighbor's tree that the neighbor was happy to share in exchange for 2 jars of the finished product. She fermented cabbage into sauerkraut because fermentation requires no energy, no special equipment, and produces a preserved food that lasts 8 months without refrigeration. By the time the first frost came in October, Clara had 312 jars of preserved food in her root cellar. She had cataloged them in a notebook. She knew exactly what she had, exactly how long each item would last, and exactly in what order to use them to minimize waste and maximize variety through the winter. That notebook is the detail that matters most, because the difference between Clara and a family that ran out of food in February was not how much they had put up. It was whether they knew what they had and managed it deliberately. Clara's pantry was not a hoard. It was an inventory. She managed it the way a business manages stock. First in, first out, tracked, rotated, replenished. The third layer was the exchange network. Clara could not grow everything. She had no fruit trees. She had no chickens. The landlord didn't permit them. She had no way to produce cooking oil, flour, or the small amounts of sugar her family used. For those things, she traded. Her neighbor Ruth had chickens and more eggs than her family could eat. Her neighbor George had a fruit cellar full of apples and pears from the 2 trees in his yard. The woman 3 houses down, Mrs. Papadopoulos, made a Greek-style cheese from goat milk that her family produced from 2 goats kept in a small pen behind the house. Clara traded preserved tomatoes for eggs. She traded pickles for apples. She traded 2 jars of apple butter, made from George's own apples, which he found quietly amusing, for a 5-pound wheel of cheese that lasted her family 6 weeks. No money changed hands, no receipts existed. No platform took a percentage. What existed was a neighborhood food economy that predated the grocery store and continued operating quietly alongside it until the Depression made it not just useful, but essential. By January 1931, Clara's exchange network included 9 households. Between them, they produced eggs, dairy, fruit, vegetables, dried beans, fresh bread, cured meat from a pig one family slaughtered in November, and enough variety that no family in the network ate the same thing 2 nights in a row. Here is what that network was worth in real terms. A study from the University of Vermont's Food Systems program found that households participating in active food exchange networks with neighbors reduced their annual grocery spend by an average of 22% compared to isolated households at the same income level. For a household spending $1,000 a month on food, that's $2,640 per year. Invested at 7% over 20 years, $108,000. From trading tomatoes for eggs with your neighbor. The 4th layer is the one Clara used in week 11, the one I told you about at the beginning. By February, the garden was dormant. The root cellar was past its peak. The exchange network had slowed because winter had reduced what everyone was producing, and Clara's husband had still not found work. What Clara did in week 11 was forage. Not in wilderness, not on rural land, in the city of Wichita, Kansas, in the middle of winter. She knew which trees in the neighborhood were black walnut trees because she had been watching them since August. She harvested the walnuts in October before the first frost and stored them in mesh bags in the cellar. She knew which vacant lots had wild onion patches, allium plants that grow in disturbed soil and are nutritionally identical to cultivated onions. She knew that rose hips, the seed pods of wild and ornamental rose bushes, were still clinging to the branches in February and contained more vitamin C per gram than oranges. She picked them, dried them, and made a tea that kept her children from getting sick in the months when fresh produce was otherwise unavailable. She knew which of her neighbors had winter root vegetables, parsnips, turnips, carrots, still in the ground under straw mulch, available to anyone willing to dig for them in exchange for help with other tasks. She knew when the local church distributed surplus bread from its weekly community meals, and she was there with a cloth bag every time. This was not desperation. This was knowledge. Clara had been accumulating it since childhood, passed down from a mother who had grown up on a farm in rural Missouri, who had learned it from her own mother, who had needed it not as a strategy, but as a way of life. And here is the thing about foraging knowledge in a modern context that most people miss entirely. You do not need to live in the countryside. You do not need acres of land. The USDA's own agricultural extension network has documented edible wild plants growing in every major American city. Dandelion greens, which are nutritionally superior to spinach, grow in virtually every unmaintained lawn and park. Wood sorrel, lamb's quarters, purslane, all edible, all nutritious, all available in urban and suburban environments for free. The knowledge of what they are and how to use them is the only barrier. And that knowledge takes approximately 1 afternoon to begin acquiring. Clara did not forage because she was desperate. She foraged because she understood something that the grocery store model has almost completely erased. Food is not a product. It is an environment. And the environment, if you know how to read it, is generous. Now let me show you what Clara's complete system looks like, translated into numbers for 2025. A 200-square-foot garden, planted with high-yield crops, produces $800 to $1,200 worth of fresh produce per season. A basic home preservation setup, a water bath canner, a dozen mason jars, a ceramic crock for fermentation, costs approximately $140 and lasts decades. A household exchange network with 3 to 5 neighbors, actively trading surplus garden produce, preserved goods, and skills, reduces annual food spending by an estimated 20 to 25%. Basic foraging knowledge, applied even occasionally, contributes an estimated $200 to $400 in food value per year for a household that knows what to look for. Combined and applied consistently over 10 years, Clara's system reduces a median American household's food spending by an estimated 30 to 40%. On a monthly food budget of $1,000, that is $300 to $400 per month saved. $3,600 to $4,800 per year. Invested at 7% over 20 years, that is between $148,000 and $197,000. From a garden, some mason jars, and the knowledge of what your neighbors are growing. Clara never calculated any of this. She didn't need to. The system wasn't built to generate a return. It was built to feed her children. The wealth it produced was a byproduct of competence. The natural result of knowing how to do something the market had not yet convinced her she needed to pay someone else to do. The grocery store did not destroy Clara's system. It made it invisible. It convinced 2 generations of Americans that the skills Clara carried were primitive, inefficient, and beneath the dignity of a modern household. That convenience was progress. That dependence was sophistication. And then 2020 happened, and the shelves went empty. And people stood in aisles, staring at gaps where the flour used to be, and felt for the first time what Harold felt on that sidewalk in Detroit in 1933, the cold, specific fear of a system that was supposed to be reliable, revealing that it was not. Clara would not have been in that aisle. Her pantry had flour. Her garden had seeds ready for spring. Her neighbor Ruth had chickens that were still laying. Her system was running exactly as designed, indifferent to what was happening in the supply chain, because it did not depend on the supply chain. That is not nostalgia. That is architecture. And you can start building it this week for less than you spent on takeout last Thursday. Here is what I want you to do. Not 7 things. 1. Go to a garden center or a hardware store and buy 1 seed packet of something that grows fast and produces heavily in a small space. Radishes are ready in 25 days. Bush beans produce for 8 weeks from a 2-foot row. A single zucchini plant will produce more food than you expect. Plant it in a pot, on a balcony, in a window box, in a corner of your yard. Watch it grow. Eat what it makes. That is how Clara started. Not with a 200-square-foot garden, with what she had, where she was, doing what she knew. The system grows from there. It always does. If this changed the way you think about where your food actually comes from and what it would take to produce some of it yourself, subscribe. Because next week, we go into that underground economy that Depression families built when money disappeared entirely. And the numbers behind it will genuinely surprise you. And leave 1 comment. Do you have any kind of food system right now? A garden, a pantry, a neighbor you trade with? Or are you starting from 0? I want to know where you are. I read every single one. The grocery store is a convenience. What Clara knew is a foundation. And foundations outlast everything built on top of them.